All right. Hey, everyone. So we're in for our July live Q&A, and we're going to answer quite a few questions. I got actually a lot of feedback this month and some questions and things you guys are curious about. So I'll do my best to answer them as clearly as possible. And we'll have a few items where I'll probably refer out to maybe some resources or other things I have. And I'll just put a keyword in as we're talking about them, and you can just put them either in the chat or in the comments below, and I'll follow up with you and get those resources sent over to you. So without further ado, let's jump in here. So first question we've got is from Elnato, and he's basically saying that as a student, he goes through a workout cycle every 3 to 6 months. And so it ends up going something like this. So his vacation comes at the end of the term, consistently works out, builds up strength, and he'll get a few PRs, but he won't really see any huge increases in strength, any big progressions basically. Then around the beginning of the semester, he'll work out consistently for 1 to 2 months. Then the last couple months of the semester, he'll work out 1 to 2 times a week, and then basically just sit at his desk the rest of the time, I'd imagine due to exam stress and just not having as much free time available. And then the last couple of weeks of that semester, he'll get very little sleep, eat quite poorly, not work out, often will get sick. He'll spend a week basically recovering after that, after finals finish, and basically repeat. So he'll end up with this cycle of start out very strong, end up seeing a progressive reduction in training, and then that basically leads to very small increases in progress. So I'd imagine your question is, how do you try to break this cycle and get through it? So this is a bit of an answer, a little bit of a, you're only going to change so much type thing without changing your situation. So recovery, as we know, especially as you progress with training, is a limited resource, right? And stress is something I've said before. Ultimately, like if you're very stressed with school and exams and finals, I think one of the best things you can do is focus on maintenance and then put your recovery resources towards just getting through the schoolwork, right? From there, and the time where you have more recovery resources and time available to you to train, especially sort of on vacation and in the beginning part of the semester, put your focus on actually training very hard there. So on basically the first half of that cycle, I would say focus on training hard, work on making your progressions, go for your big lifts there, and try to get progress across the board, right? From there, when you get into that middle period where you end up effectively limited but still able to train, where you're training maybe once or twice a week, right? I would pick one lift that you want to improve on and then put the rest on maintenance. So in terms of some actionable items with this, you can pretty much maintain muscle mass and strength on as low as about a third of the volume that you build strength with. So if you normally need 15 sets a week of overloading to see progress on your squat, you could probably get by with 5 or 6 sets a week. Generally, I try to err a little bit on the safe side and aim a little closer to that 45-50%. So maybe you're aiming closer to like 7 or 8 sets a week, right? That can pretty easily be done as if you have 2 sessions a week, you could have, and you're trying to get your bench better, you could do bench press on your first training day and work on just improving that as much as possible. And then on your second training day, you do your lighter bench press day or less overloading or whatever you want to qualify it as, but then also do your squat and your deadlift and put those kind of on maintenance. Don't worry too much about overloading, just worry about getting some work in and maintaining what you have so you don't backslide. The other end of this is where you end up trying to train too much all at once. And this is a problem where, then you end up spread too thin. Those 1 to 2 sessions a week become absolutely monstrous. And then on top of that, you're still short on time, you're still short on recovery. So you're kind of just overreaching in your training, and you're going to be very hard to see any noticeable progress. So I'd say pick ahead. What do you really want to improve on? Find the most important 1 to 2 lifts and work on those. In the last couple of weeks of not getting much in terms of finals, well, I mean, if you're not training, you're not training, and that's It is what it is, right? You're not going to fix that, but some things that you can control are being more proactive with your nutrition, right? So if you are prone to getting sick, right, which is common in really high stress situations or after them particularly, nutrition can help with that. So maybe ahead of time when you're when you still have a little bit of extra time to work with before crunch time with your exams, work on, laying out a nutrition strategy or nutrition plan where you can action on it very easily. Or even easier would be bulk cook, and every time you make your food for the week, for example, make twice as much. So if you do that for basically 3 weeks, you have 3 weeks of food that you can put in your freezer, and this way you can just heat and eat your kind of healthy, good nutrition meals. And at least this way, instead of going with absolutely nothing working in your direction, you've at least got some quality nutrition to support you in a time of, poor sleep and frankly, just a poor training environment because it's not happening, right? With any luck at all, that helps cull back on how much time you lose on that recovery week. And overall, that process lets you be a little bit more focused. Ultimately, the more limited we are on recovery, the more we have to be specific with what are we trying to improve. And we can't go with this broad swath of, trying to get bigger, lose fat, gain strength on all 3 lifts, and improve technique and improve tendon issues and so on and so forth. Cool. So that's first question. Our next question comes from Aiden. So Aiden's seen, I know, a couple of my videos talking about joint position and bony position and how that's going to affect muscle function. And his question is how to address SI joint issues. So he's had basically uneven strength in his legs and hips, which may manifest in one or both hips, and his knees will end up caving in at various points in the squat or deadlift, which he suspects is probably leading to some SI joint issues. So SI joint issues, I think we need to look at from a couple standpoints, right? So first and foremost is most SI joint issues that I see are also lumbar spine issues. Very seldom do we see them in isolation where it's just one or just the other. And they're also generally a hip issue, right? Your SI joint literally is the joint between your spine and your hip. And if we're not addressing both ends of that, we're generally missing something. So first and foremost, in terms of things we want to work on, I would take a look at seeing if there is any asymmetry, right? Especially most SI joint issues will tend to present on one side or another, but see if there's an asymmetry and how you're shifting, right? So for example, what I'll commonly see is if a lifter is shifting over to the right, for example, right? In their squat and their hips are twisting that way, and then that right knee falls in, I would probably go through a 90-90 hip shift. And if you want an access to this training, I did a whole training on fixing hip shift a couple months back. Just comment hip shift in the comments below and I'll send it over. So with this training, the idea being we would have you laying on your back and you're taking your hips and working on shifting the right hip up to actually rotate your hips over to the left. So if you tend to rotate to the right, we teach you how to rotate to the left and then work on breathing mechanics from there. This isn't really going to fix the problem per se, but what it does do is it opens the door so that you can now go train in a more symmetrical fashion or access the side that's missing more easily, right? From there, in terms of improving strength on the left and the right, the first place that I'd start with actually addressing a strength issue is finding alignment. So we'll get a little whiteboard going here. And we'll get that. Okay, so commonly what I'll end up seeing with, there we go. What we'll end up seeing with single leg work, especially with powerlifters, and we're just going to draw Joe Schmo here, is they'll set themselves up like this, right? So there's our torso, and then they'll have their leg forward here. And we're just going to draw the leg as sort of one line, right? And then their other leg will be back and whatever, right? And what they'll end up doing is they'll end up loading basically right down the middle. So their center of mass will end up pretty much over the middle of their feet like it would be in a squat, for example, right? Now, in a squat, that's not an issue because you've got one leg on either side of your body, and that's going to support you, right? So you're here, life is good. That fall line tracks, right? When you're in a true single leg movement, so this could be like a pistol squat, single leg deadlift, some reverse lunge variations, stuff like that. If your weight is here, you're going to have to do something to adjust, right? And so commonly what we'll see is lifters will go from kind of this position here. They don't move where their hips are, but instead what they'll end up doing is they'll basically tilt their body. And so we'll get rid of this and get rid of this. And they'll basically bring their head over here to get some weight over that leg, right? And so their torso will end up looking a little bit more like this. So still going to start here, but they'll end up basically leaning over that side with their head in order to get some weight on this leg. Because otherwise, you know, if your weight is centered, you're just going to fall over, right? So technically this strategy works, but if you're really looking to address alignment-based strength issues in your legs, especially when we're talking about SI joint issues, we need to have the hips shift over the torso or shift over our base of support. So our base of support in a single leg movement is that foot that's on the ground because that's the only thing that's on the ground, right? And what we need to do is we need to actually take the hips and move the hips over, right? So when we move the hips over, you can think about it just like literally shifting the hips across. But then what that does is if we kind of rewind to our initial example here, all of this is now moving over the leg, right? Naturally, the angle of this leg would change because your leg anchors at your hip. And you're looking at something a little bit more like this now, where your leg is going to be angled inwards relative to the hip. But now we actually have our whole body centered over our base of support. Okay. What that 90-90 hip shift does is it helps you feel that change in angle. So if you think about this pen being my hips and then my hands being my legs, if I'm laying on my back, my legs would be in the air, right? And as I pull up like this, you can see how this angle closes off, right? That's basically what's happening over here, right? We're going into pelvic internal rotation, which positions the leg in basically a position where the hip sits onto the femur more. We get more joint centration, and then you can, by extension of that, use that leg more effectively, right? The argument for joint centration is generally what we'll see most people talk about when we're looking for, you know, maximizing force, and many of the form corrections we'll see in powerlifting. That's generally going to be the target, is maximizing how stable we can get and how much surface area we can get on the actual joint. That's going to allow us to articulate the joint better and generally express more force. There's some exceptions, but this is a good starting point, right? So for your single leg work, for addressing leg strength imbalances, I would work on shifting your weight over the leg that you're trying to work on, and then training your normal single leg stuff. So, you know, single leg deadlifts, lunges, split squats, staggered stance deadlifts are all going to be really, really good places to start. And then working with a 90-90 hip shift, if you're experiencing a shift in those bilateral movements, will be a good place to open the door to this kind of stuff, basically. Okay, cool. So next we've got Megan. She's asking on my thoughts on maintaining personal records while concurrently working on other things. So very similar to Alnato's question, but let's reframe it just under the context of, you know, the powerlift specifically, with less focus on life stressors and being a student, right? So if you're choosing to, you know, focus on some different goals, let's say, for example, within the context of powerlifting, you're just simply wanting to develop your technique a little bit more, or maybe a better example would just be simply focus on aesthetics more. So you're still lifting weights, but the focus is now not so much your 1 rep max. Instead, the focus is on looking better on the beach, right? So the first thing we need to look at is, with our 2 sets of goals, how much overlap is there, right? So with, powerlifting and with bodybuilding, for lack of physique training, there's a reasonable amount of overlap in the sense that they're both going to involve strength training with progressive overload. The difference being physique and sort of muscular development and hypertrophy is really the focus here. Whereas your 1 rep max is the only focus here, right? There's some body weight component to powerlifting, but it's not as much of a component as it would be here. So once we've established how much overlap there is between the two, we can start to design our approach, right? So we want to basically rule out all this stuff that doesn't end up in the middle of that Venn diagram and is specific to our original powerlifting goals, so our PRs, stuff that we're trying to maintain, and say, okay, what do we have to do in order to just meet our criteria on the powerlifting side? So the goal here being, how do we maintain our strength in the lifts, or at least reduce strength as much as possible, right? So first place I'd start with this would be not looking at your true max, so once you peak and all that, but I'd look instead at your training max. And for most lifters, this is going to be about 90 to 95% of their actual PR. From there, we're going to take the normal training volumes that you would get to generally get stronger, and you're going to take about 1/3 of those, 45 to 50% if you've got the room in your plan, and organize that into 1 to 2 weekly sessions where you're focusing on powerlifting. Whether you do 1 or 2 sessions is just basically going to depend on how much volume you end up needing. So if you're somebody who tends to train with fairly moderate to low volumes, I'd say you could likely get away with doing 1 session a week with all 3 lifts, just focusing on reasonably high intensity, so 75 to 90% of your max, and training at about 45 to 50% of your normal training volumes. Again, the focus on this is not necessarily trying to get stronger with them. It's just get enough work in that you don't get weaker, and find the minimum dose for that. So start at 45, 50%. And if you can go lower, you can go lower. In order to accumulate enough volume and not get too low too fast, or just simply overtax yourself, I'd recommend probably working in that 3 to 6 rep range will be a good place to start. That's going to be where most lifters tend to spend their time building strength anyways. Yeah. So from there, we basically want to look at, okay, how much other room do we have in our situation for progressing on our other goal, right? So from there, we can basically devise, okay, do I now have enough room with this 1 or 2 days a week of powerlifting training? Do I have enough room in the rest of my week to achieve my other goal, my hypertrophy-based goal? And I would argue that if your goal is, our beach body, like we talked about, then yeah, absolutely. There's so much overlap between the two that having 1 strength-focused day would actually fit in pretty nicely into a hypertrophy-based routine. It's going to help build your strength up, and that in turn will help with building the weights you're using for accumulating volume. If your goal was less specific, and let's say it was maybe a bit more of a skill-based goal, so something along the lines of you wanted to learn to ride a dirt bike really well, I'd again look at what do we need to do minimum to get powerlifting on board, right? And then after that, how much do I need to ride a dirt bike, and what else do I need to do in order to be successful? So realistically, if you've been powerlifting, you've got a good strength base. So 1 to 2 days a week of strength training, including that powerlifting session, will probably be a good place to start with that dirt bike, right? You want a good strength base that's going to keep your conditioning up. From there, you're going to have probably a couple of days of conditioning work that might overlap with actually the skill component of riding a dirt bike, right? Ultimately, with any situation that we're approaching here, we need to account for, do we have enough hours in the day and days in the week to accomplish both goals, right? What is the minimum dose that we need in order to maintain our personal records or the numbers that we're trying to keep? And then finally, what is the minimum amount of work that we need in order to improve on our secondary goal, which is now primary? I hope that answers it. If you have any questions, I realize it's kind of high level concepts with that part. Let me know if you've got any questions about that one. Okay. Last three questions we've got are definitely a little simpler. So Brandon asks on any foot rooting cues he has for staying over the midfoot in the squat. So two things I'd raise here. So one is making sure that you're moving your body in a way where you're centering the bar over your foot. Because if the bar is way behind your foot, so again, like if this is my midfoot right here, and then I'm setting myself up where that bar is way over here, I'm going to have to do some really funky stuff to get myself over the midfoot, right? So assuming that I'm starting here and I'm starting to go through the motion and I'm just simply, my limiting point is not in body position, but it's in the feet themselves, then I would go with one of two cues. And then there's one exercise I like to use with these as well. So first cue would be on just simply imagining a short foot. So I've seen Kabuki talk about this quite a lot, where they take the base of the big toe. We'll just pull up a little picture here, actually. So they'll take the base of the big toe and they'll take basically the inside of the heel, and they'll imagine basically approximating these. So let's go copy image and we'll go to whiteboard. Or we're going to go to paint. Let's try this again. Okay, so with that foot, we're here and we're imagining basically taking this point on the foot, not at the big toe itself, but basically right here. So that first metatarsal, that big ball of your foot. And then the medial part of your heel. And imagining trying to shorten those two up. And what that does is it basically creates an arch in the foot, right? So imagining creating that short or active foot and really trying to pull those 2 points together can be really, really useful in creating a short foot. The second that I like is, we'll go back again here, is the idea of a 4-point foot. So I used to talk about tripod foot quite a lot, but I found that it doesn't really work around, frankly, a lot of the compensations that we'll see. So we'll end up kind of overweighting the inside of the foot, and then that's no good either, right? So with our tripod foot, or 4-point foot, I should say, we're imagining weight again, basically near the front of that first metatarsal, near the front of the 5th metatarsal, so kind of just in front of the little ball of your foot. And then instead of the tripod foot where we weight here, we weight through the back edge of the inside of the heel and the back edge of the outside of the heel, and really being deliberate about weighting through really the back of the heel here, as opposed to through the center, is one that I've found quite useful at really creating a full and stable foot. So 2 cues you've got, 1 being short foot, 2 being a 4-point foot. Try both and see which resonate with you best. The other thing I'll add is I actually have a free training on how to center or find your center of mass in order to stay over your midfoot in your squat. It's a pretty quick 4-minute video, something like that. If you're interested in that, just comment midfoot in the comments and I will get that sent over to you. Great. All right, moving on. We've got Dominique asking, what's the best way to find your optimal bench press grip? So bench press grip, I generally try to think of it in sort of 2 categories, right? So one is we're going to end up with the technique and injury prevention side of things, right? So how consistent can you be with your technique? How much can you bench without running into shoulder issues, right? And then the second is absolute strength, right? So I would start at whatever you're doing right now and then build it into your variations, right? So just auto-regulate your variations. And if I advocate for this actually quite a lot. If you have a block where you're working on your weak points in your bench, program, if you're weak at lockout, program a closer grip bench variation, right? And then as you auto-regulate and as you build the skill of doing a close grip bench, you can really find out, okay, how strong or how weak am I at this variation? Similarly, on a block or two down the road, you're probably going to end up doing a variation where you're trying to work on playing to your strengths. So you might try going the other end of the spectrum and going with a wider grip bench press, at which point you might find you are weaker or stronger, right? And of those three, you're going to end up with, okay, where am I strongest? And also, what are my shoulders happiest with? What are my elbows and wrists happiest with? And based on kind of that, whatever grip answers that question the best, I would go in that direction. So if you find, hey, with a wide grip bench, I felt stronger than a regular, kind of split the difference, right? So instead of going normal and instead of going wide, go halfway and find, okay, is this better or is the actual wide grip better? And play with those. It takes some time. There's no real straight answer. It's not like sumo deadlifts where I've found a really good anatomical equation. I've seen lifters with crazy long arms be super strong benching with a close grip. I've seen lifters with really weird builds doing basically really well in all variations of bench grip. So as long as it fits within the competition standards that you're competing in, or if you're not, as long as it works for your shoulders, you don't blow them out, try for a couple blocks at a time, so about 8 weeks or so, and find what's best. Last question we've got is from Marina, and it's how often to test your 1 rep max. So I think that most lifters shouldn't really be testing their 1 rep max a lot. I think you should be looking at your estimated 1 rep max and looking for basically signs of maxes going up. So I think in terms of an upper end of the frequency, I'd say testing 1 rep max 4 times a year is probably about as much as I'd want to do it. Generally, I try to stay with lifters and I'm working with them. 2 to 4 competitions a year is that sweet spot for being able to sustain it, right? 4 is definitely on the aggressive side, but I've seen it done. Not everyone will do great with it, but 2 is good for most anyways. With watching for your maxes going up, I would say pay attention to your reps, right? So if your previous 5 rep max before you deadlifted 500 pounds, if your previous 5 rep max before you pulled 500 pounds was 430 pounds, let's say, and then you go and pull a 5 rep max of 450 pounds, well, we could probably say that you got at least some benefit to doing your 5s and you're stronger now, and doing 430 for 5 is probably going to mean you deadlift more than 500 now. The closer you get to a 1 rep max, so getting down to 3s and 2s, the more accurate that statement is going to be. But I would look at it more that way. And then in terms of testing, save it for your peak weeks, your peaking blocks, and your competitions, and try to only really go for a true max 2 to 4 times a year is what I like to use in my coaching. That's what I found to be sustainable. And frankly, the name of the game with powerlifting is longevity. If you can stay in the sport for longer, you get stronger. And honestly, just being hurt sucks. So if we can avoid that, that's always better. That's pretty much it. Okay, great. So as always, if you have any extra questions or you want any of those free resources I've mentioned, drop a comment with the keyword below and I'll get it sent over to you. Thank you very much. Catch you later.